להרגיש באמת בבית.
Yeah, good to
Literally
see you.
בבית, אבל גם בבית.
יפה. גם, good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
בהצלחה.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, so this is our second shir for our opening session of Beit Midrash Boker this year, and I'm very happy to see a whole bunch of new names and people who are joining us for the first time, and I'm hoping you'll continue with how the shir will be running every week, more or less the entire year, and you'll be able to follow everything over there. And those of you who are not on our mailing list, you can send a message either here through the chat or through by email or through by phone, and we'll be able to add you to the list, and you'll get the link and you'll get the speakers every week in advance. To make it a little easier, I'll put my phone number on the chat here, and then you can copy it down later. And besides that, we're really very happy to welcome Rabbi Herzl Hefter, who was a Rosh Kol of ours many years ago in Cleveland. And when this program, the Beit Midrash program, started 9 years ago, so he was one of the key speakers and a very significant part of the program. And now we're having him back as a guest speaker. Hopefully, in the future, we'll be able to have it a little more often. But for now, we're happy that you're here. And bechavod, it's all yours. You are already the co-host in the thing, so you can share screen as you need.
Yes. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emmanuel. It's really I'm really very happy to be back. And thank you, Zev Schwartz. I just have a request, if it's at all possible, to turn on your videos. But as Harold so gently asked that people should be muted, but I'd like to see people's faces. It makes a very big difference when we're doing Zoom. So if unless you're indisposed, please turn on your videos. Thank you. Okay, so now I see a lot of familiar faces. It's really great. And welcome to those people who I don't know, and I'm happy to meet you even in this limited capacity. Okay. So I'll tell you what I've been thinking about. If the last 2 years taught us anything, it's that we're not really in control of our lives and our surroundings. I mean, we knew that intellectually before, but I think we all felt it and feel it very viscerally when it comes to having our, if anybody actually got sick, or having our freedom limited by bidud and by distancing. So what I want to try to figure out is, like, this poses, I believe, a very serious spiritual challenge. The idea that we're not really in control, and to some extent we're actually powerless in our surroundings, and the sense of power that we have and control has revealed itself to be somewhat of an illusion. We live in this, apparent reality where we thought we were in control, right? And that has revealed itself as not true, right? So there's this veneer that has been, or veil that has been torn away. And now we see that we're not really in control. So you could make a Mussardic, conclusion out of it. But I want to, where God is really in control, etc. And that's all true, but I don't think that really helps. The question is, once we realize deeply, and once we experience the fact that we're really powerless to a large degree, how can we interact with the world in a meaningful way alongside the experience of ourselves as being powerless? What impact can we make that's meaningful if at the end of the day I don't really have any power, and it just depends on some virus or on something else, right? The virus is just this time, but it really reveals something about the nature of human beings and the world. So what I want to begin to try to tackle this with a Gemara that people know but it's rather, when you think about it, it's rather difficult. I'm going to share my screen. Some of you may have the sources because I sent them out earlier through a manual. I don't know if you got it, but I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. Let me just find this. Here we are. Okay, people see that, right? Okay, I've shared my screen here. Okay, you can just like raise your hand virtually. There's a thing just so I know that people.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so I want to start with this short Gemara, which some of you may have heard, but I want to try to see what it might really mean. Okay, this is a Gemara from Masechet Yoma. Okay, Amar Reish Lakish, the first source, right? Amar Reish Lakish, Gdola Teshuva Shizdonot Naasot Lo Shgagot. Right, repentance has this power of turning willful sins into, let's say, minor indiscretions. Right, let's translate it that way. That you did something on purpose, but through tshuva, it's considered that you did it unwittingly. Right, and then the Gemara continues. It asks, V'hama Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says something else which seems to be in contradiction to this. I'm on the second line here, right here. Okay. V'hama Reish Lakish, Gdola Teshuva shezdonot naasot lo kischuyot. Teshuva, repentance, has this power of actually transforming willful sins into merits. Right, the total transformation from one to another. Shene'emaru b'shuv rashami rishato v'asha v'asa mishpat utzedaka aleihem yichyeh. Right, the way they're interpreting the verse is that the evil things that a evil person has done will be transformed, and that will become the foundation of his life moving forward. That means that the zdonot, the evil things that are done willfully, will become actually schuyot, will be considered meritorious. Okay, now that's like a very nice thing to say, but how does that work exactly? I did something bad, or something bad happened in my life, and I look and somehow now magically, retroactively, it becomes something good. Now, so when you look at this Gemara, it sounds like there's some sort of, you could say, mystical changing of the past, right? By virtue of the fact that a person does tshuva, their evil deeds are now, God, so to speak, considers them as merits, right? Now, that's sort of a very external way of describing this Gemara, and that's how. And I want to move to Rab Tzadok HaKomi Lublin, and that's how he sets it up. It's sort of a straw man. But let's see what he says. He says, he asks the following question. V'hinei, he quotes this Gemara, and he says, V'hinei tzarich lahavin. We have to understand. Ma inyan shezdonot naasot lo kishgagot. What does it mean that things that sins, crimes that someone committed willfully will be considered as if they were committed by accident? It says, Mima nafshach, im nimchal ha'avon legamre, lo yisharu mimenu shum roshem. Okay? V'im lo nimchal, halohu haya mezid. So he sort of sets up a straw man. He says, I don't understand. If God forgave the sins completely, so then there's nothing remaining from them. So they're not even like shgagot. And if God did not forgive the sins, then the sins were done b'mezid. They were done willfully. But what is this like knocking down or changing the status? Either it's there or it's not there. So asking the question is a bit naive. It's like a naive sort of question because he's looking at it, you could say, metaphysically. In other words, there's some sort of change that happens in the world out there as a consequence of tshuva. And if you understand this Gemara that way, then it doesn't really make sense. mean, either God forgave you, if he didn't forgive you, what is this transforming what happened into something else? That's what he doesn't understand. Okay, everybody with me on that? Yeah, I need to see some faces. This is a problem that we have with, yeah, I'm unsharing my screen. So I just want to see that you're with me. Yeah?
Rabbi, there was a request if you could,
you can just nod your head.
Rabbi, there was a request if you could enlarge the
What's
font.
that?
Make the font bigger.
Okay, no problem. I'll do that when I reshare my screen. I'll make it larger. Okay, so everybody with me on the question? All right, so let's go back to sharing my screen. I hope I'll be successful making the font larger. 1 second. Let's see. Is that, oh no, it's too big. Is that better? Rav Zev, that's better?
Too much. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
If you need it bigger, just tell me, right? All right. So let's see what Rav Tzadok does with this.
Too much.
Is he shifts, he's going to shift for us the meaning of this statement in the Gemara. And he's, right, the Gemara made a distinction between tshuva me'ava and tshuva me'ira. When a person does tshuva me'ira, in other words, out of fear of being punished, so then it transforms the volitional act into something which was non-volitional. But if he does tshuva me'ava out of love, so then that transforms the transgression into a merit. But in any case, we have to understand what this means. So he says as follows: V'hinei ka'asher ra'a Yosef shenitchartu echav al mechirato. When Yosef saw that his brothers regretted, had remorse for selling him, Ke'omram, as they themselves said, aval ashimim anachnu al achinu, right? They said, we are guilty for our brother. Remember when the brothers are discussing this among themselves, right? They don't know Yosef is listening. They don't know it's Yosef, right? And they say, oh, this is all happening to us because we're guilty of selling our brother. So they accepted the guilt, and that's a tshuva, but it's tshuva me'ira, because it's why are they saying this? What moved them to accept responsibility for what they had done? The fear now of their situation, and now this capricious Egyptian minister is gonna do terrible things to them, right? So they're afraid, right? So he says, Kasher higishu shezeu v'zeh haya mi'yirata onesh, right? And this was because of fear of punishment, right? Zeh haya mi'yirata onesh. Kasher higishu shezeh mitzad ha'onesh shel ha'mechira v'yada she'al kol panim. Okay, so this is why the brothers were doing tshuva, but it was out of fear of punishment. Now, Yosef knows v'yada she'al kol panim yen nish'ar b'nafsham ha'etzev al ha'avar. Yosef understood that since their repentance was a function of fear of punishment, like they say, there are no atheists in the foxhole, right? So there's a fear of you're in a dangerous situation. So everybody's from. Right, but that's really that's me'ira, from fear. So he understood that that's not transformative. That there'll be, I wouldn't say sadness. Etzev here would be like anxiety or feelings of remorse and discomfort, that it will remain with them. It will still be a part of their past. Right? Even if they did tshuva, right, it'll still eat at them. V'gam harogez v'hacharada al ha'atid kanizkar. So not only will they still experience anxiety and remorse for what had been, but it also fills them with fear and trembling about the future. In other words, the imprint, when a person commits a crime, a moral crime. I'm not talking about double parking your car or something like that, right? When a person commits a crime, it has a blemish. It leaves a blemish on their consciousness, and it affects how they view the past and also their ability to encounter the future, right? It's a cloud on them, on their consciousness. And this is what Yosef understood, right? Va'al zeh amar lahem, and that's why Yosef said to the brothers, Va'ata al te'atzvu. He said, don't be anxious, don't have this blemish upon you. And why is that? I'm skipping a little bit. He says, Shigam me'ama'aseh, right, from this action that you did, lo yisha'er shum pgam, there'll be no blemish left from your action of selling me. Ki ha'ma'aseh haya l'tova, because the action, now we can understand, I'm adding to embellish the Reb Tzadok to understand more fully, Ki ha'ma'aseh haya l'tova, because the action that you did, even though at the time, right, the way it says in the pasuk, Va'atem chashavtem alai ra'ah, v'ha'elohim chashava l'tova. You were thinking evil thoughts upon me, but God had in mind for the best, right? Ki ma'aseh haya l'tova, ki lemichya shlachani Elohim lifneichem. Because God arranged this, that I should be a lifeline for you. So what you did was necessary and actually good when seen in a broader perspective, right? Ki gam Yosef ba'atzmo haya mefuyas bazeh, right? And Yosef himself accepted this, okay? V'al yidei zeh na'aseh Moshe b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, that through this he became the minister who ruled all of Egypt. ועל המחשבה שלכם, אתי מחשבת חרטה ודיבור של וידוי, ומוציא מיד המחשבה הרעה כאמור. So what changes? Yosef says, if you can think about what happened differently and understand the broader context, which I have come to understand, namely that what happened was for the best, not in a shallow way, right? But I really deeply understand that this was for the best. This actually can erase your evil thoughts. And now this, this cloud over your consciousness can be dispersed. That's what Yosef is trying to teach them, okay? Now, as an aside, I'm not sure he was successful, because at the end of Sefer Bereshit, this I'm just saying to understand Joseph and his brothers, I'm digressing a bit. But at the end of Sefer Bereshit, the brothers are not totally reconciled with Yosef, right? They make up the story about that Yaakov told them that to tell Yosef not to be angry at them and not to take vengeance against them, and they're afraid that Yosef is going to take vengeance against them. So unfortunately, the division, the gulf between the brothers, Yosef and the rest of his brothers, was not entirely erased, and that's the alienation, and it's really depressing, the end of Sefer Bereshit, the alienation that endures from the Mechira, and that's what ultimately, is rolls into the Galut of Mitzrayim and the later splitting up of the kingdom into Yosef and the other tribes. But that's a whole separate story. But this is what Yosef is trying to teach them. He wasn't entirely successful, but maybe he can teach it to us. Okay, so what lies at the core of the way Rabbi Tzadok is reading this? And the truth is, if you look back at the psukim, it's not far from the pshat, right? When Yosef says, "Atem chashavtam elai ra'ah, al te'atzvu," don't be fearful, don't be anxious, don't feel negative feelings, because even though you had evil thoughts at the time, there's an acknowledgement of that by Yosef. You did want to do me evil, but Elohim chashava l'tova, but God was thinking about it for the best, and that is the new way. This is what's really important: the new way to interpret what happened. Okay, that's what Yosef is trying to tell them. We cannot change the facts. The facts are that you sold me into slavery. That's a fact, right? So that's where our the powerlessness or the helplessness that we have, that we experience. You can't change the past. The empirical facts are the facts, but we do have a certain amount of control. What do we have control over? Okay. I want to move, I want to leave that question open, okay, for a second, and read one line from a Mea Shiloach, and then I'm going to embellish this with some things which I'm thinking about from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, okay, which might be surprising to some people, but Nietzsche has a lot to teach us about this. But let's just see the Mea Shiloach first. The Mea Shiloach says, see the Mea Shiloach here? This is the Mea Shiloach, yeah? Okay. So the Mea Shiloach says he's commenting on the words that Paro says to Yosef when he extracts Yosef from the bor, from prison. So of course Paro has his dreams that he's disturbed by, and he says to Yosef, I heard about you, Tishma chalom liftoroto. You can hear a dream or listen to a dream, and you have the power to interpret it, right? That's what Paro said. So commenting upon this, the Mea Shiloach begins to talk about dreams in general, okay? Not just the dreams of Paro, and the whole idea of interpretation of dreams. And he says as follows, this is just one line from a slightly longer piece, but this is what's really relevant for us. Hainu, that is to say, yeah, everybody with me here? Yeah, you can unmute yourselves and say yes, okay? Yeah, everybody with me?
Yeah, we're with you.
Good, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, Tishma chalom liftoroto, hainu ki kol inyanei olam hazeh hein kechalom hatzarich pitaron, ukemo sheyiftor lo ha'adam kain yakum. The next word is etzlo. I don't have it there, okay? So he says, this is very interesting, that, you see, he says that the world in which we live is also like a dream. It's like a dream in the sense that the world begs interpretation, just like a dream begs interpretation. And however we interpret it, and the way it's interpreted is the way it happens for the person. So a couple of things here. First of all, this is actually a point that Freud makes in the beginning. Freud, of course, wrote a book called The Interpretation of Dreams. Okay, so in his introduction, he makes a very simple point. He goes through like a survey of different attitudes towards dreams for the last thousands of years. So he says some people just think it's, some people think it's the God speaking to them. And he says, and some people think, he was a neurologist, that it's just like random firings of neurons in the brain and it doesn't have any meaning, right? So he says, if that's how you look at it, then there's no reason to interpret dreams. The whole, you can say, project of interpreting dreams assumes that dreams have some sort of hidden meaning, right? If you think it doesn't have any meaning, then you're wasting your time interpreting it, right? So what the Mea Shiloach is assuming that, of course, and he says that the world is like that as well. Like if Freud would say, right, why do I bother interpreting dreams? What's the meaning? Because the dreams are an expression of hidden aspects of your consciousness, of your unconscious, which for various reasons you can't express directly. So they come out in your dreams. So you can uncover what's going on in your unconscious by interpreting dreams, right? So what the Mea Shiloach is saying is that that's not only true of dreams, that's true of the world. In other words, what is the assumption? The assumption is that the world has meaning. The world has some sort of meaning. If the world didn't have any meaning, then you'd be wasting your time interpreting it. Like people interpret history, they interpret events in their own lives, right? What we do is interpret events in our lives, right? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? What was the meaning of it? So we're assuming there's meaning. So he said, yes, there's meaning. And here's what's very interesting. Kasher Ukemoshi yiftor lo ha'adam kein yakum etzlo. The interpretation, right, is what creates the reality. There's meaning there. Here's the paradox. But as you interpret, that's what will be. So on the one hand, right, this is like a double-edged, this is really double-edged, because on the one hand, this could be very depressing. Because a dream, like Freud would say, the dream has some sort of meaning. It has, Freud was very doctrinaire. It has a true meaning. This is what Freud would say. And he's going to find out what it is, right, through the psychoanalytic method, right? So it has a meaning, a true meaning, which the process of, for him, of psychoanalysis will uncover the true meaning. The Mea Shiloach would agree with that, so to speak, not in terms of the psychoanalytic method, but that interpretation is meant to uncover some meaning. But at the same time, he says, Kasher yiftor lo hadam kein yakum. According to how you interpret, that's what will be. So there's a dual thing here. On the one hand, this could be considered like very fatalistic. There's a meaning here which is prescribed, which you can't change. The only thing you can do is uncover it. So you might not know the meaning, so you are in uncertainty, but there is a meaning and you don't really have free will, right? So, and you're stuck. It's like if you're reading Anna Karenina. Let me ask you a question, right? People, I assume most of you have read Anna Karenina. Does Anna Karenina have a free will when it comes to having the affair? I forgot what the guy's name was. I don't remember his name. The guy, Vronsky, right? Vronsky, his name was, right? Does she have a free will? You can't rewrite the book. The book is written already. She has no free will, right? So it's a closed system. The chalom is there. The world is there. And there's nothing you can do. You're totally helpless, right? She's helpless. Tolstoy already decided her fate when he wrote the book, the Gamarnu, right? But here he's saying that according to the way you interpret, that's what will happen. So there's this paradox of like this closed book, literally a closed book, and at the same time, the book is open to interpretation. Okay, now let's try to get our heads around this, because this is related to, I'm going to want to go back to this idea that the way the brothers, right, what Reb Tzadok says, that the way the brothers come to understand what happened, you can't change the empirical facts. The past is the past, right? So you can't change that. But you can change the way you understand it. And that affects you as a human being in terms of who you are. And there you do have power. Kasher u'kamoshi yiftor lo ha'adam kein yakum. Okay? So I want to digress for a moment. It's not really a digression. I want to take a look with you at two relatively short sections from written by the German philosopher Nietzsche. Okay, they're both from a book called The Gay Science. Okay, as you can see, the references, one is section 276 and the other is section 299. I'm going to read this. Okay, he says, I want to learn more and more how to see what is necessary in things as what is beautiful in them. Right? What is he saying? He wants to apply his, you could say, his psychological energy, right? The energy that he has in his personality. He wants to fashion for himself the way he looks at things. And he wants to learn how to look at things, that which is necessary in things, right? Sometimes we even call them necessary evils, right? That which is necessary in things as what is beautiful in them. I want to perceive that which is necessary as that which is beautiful, right? Thus, I will be one of those who makes things beautiful. You know, what makes something beautiful is your attitude towards it. Can you muster up the strength, and we would call it the power, right, to interpret that which is necessary as that which is beautiful. That's what he calls amor fati. That's love fate. Okay? Let that be my love from now on. I do not want to wage war against ugliness. He actually sounds a little bit about like Rav Kook here, right? Don't fight the darkness, try to bring in light, right? I do not want to wage war against ugliness. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Let looking away be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, someday I want only to be a yes-sayer. This is something for him to strive towards. It is a very hard thing to do, to look at your past, at your personal past or at the collective past, and to try to say, this is what was, and this is what needed to be, and that's what makes it beautiful. That's a very hard thing to do. For some things, look, in our personal lives, you know, people experience all sorts of things which are negative, from minor things to major tragedies. And the minor things, you know, sometimes we can say, you know, somebody say loses their job and they have a hard time for a couple of years. But then years later, they could look back and say, you know what, but I refashioned myself in those years, and then I was able to do something else. And even though at the time I didn't understand, I look back and say that was really for the best, and I wouldn't have it any other way, right? Those are certain type of things where we can come to understand what we went through, right? But there are more difficult things which make it much harder. And one could even say that, you know, you can't, it's foolish, or it's even maybe morally even corrupt to try to change things like that. Okay, but I don't want to get into that. But because of that, he says, someday I want only to be a yes-sayer. This is something like a acharit hayamim sort of thing. Like something, hopefully he wishes for himself that he should have the power to do that. Okay, so what he's emphasizing here is that what quote unquote makes something beautiful is the power of interpretation, and that rests with us, right? You can't change what is necessary. In other words, you can't change the empirical facts, but you can change the way you view things, and that is a power that we do have. Okay, let me read another piece. This is a little longer, so please bear with me. It's a very important piece. Okay, people are with me until now? Yeah? Harold, you with me? I just see you on my screen. Yeah?
Yeah.
Phil, I see you too. Yeah? Okay. Okay. He has this piece here, what one should learn from artists. Okay? What means do we have for making things beautiful, attractive, and desirable when they are not? You know, he's not naive. There are things that are not attractive. So like how can we make them look beautiful? And in themselves, I think they never are, right? The empirical facts are what they are. Then this thing is not beautiful. I mean, you could substitute beautiful for good, for redeeming, for edifying, right? He's just talking about it in terms of art, right? So that's why he's talking about beauty, okay? Here we have something to learn from physicians. Okay, let's skip what he has about physicians. You can read that yourselves. And he says about artists also. Even more from artists, okay, who are really constantly out to invent new artistic tours de force of this kind. Now he's going to talk about art and perspective. Just so bear with me. The last word on the line here is to distance oneself from things until there is much in them that one no longer sees, right? When you do perspective, like Impressionism, you don't see the details anymore. So it makes it easier to to look away from the ugliness, and much that the eye must add in order to see them at all. So there's a paradox here. When you distance yourself from something, this perspectives, so you don't see the details, but your mind, this is Gestalt psychology, he was ahead of his time here, your mind completes the picture by itself, right? So there's much the eye must add in order to see them at all, or to see things around the corner as if they were cut out and extracted from their context. This is just different artistic designs, right? And to place them so that each partially distorts the view one has of the others and allows only perspectival glances, okay? Or to look at them through colored glass or in the light of the sunset, or to give them a surface and skin that is not fully transparent. All this we should learn from artists, okay? Now listen what he says, okay? All this we should learn from artists, while otherwise being wiser than they, but we have to be smarter than the artists. For usually in their case, this delicate power stops where art ends and life begins. Right? They do this with regards to art. But what we need to do, we, however, want to be poets of our lives, starting with the smallest and most commonplace details. What he's saying is we have to make the leap from art or literature, he's talking about poetry, right? From art or literature, where the poet creates this beautiful reality through playing games with perspective, right? We have to do that with our lives so that we become, quote unquote, this is a very famous quote of Nietzsche, we need to become poets of our lives, okay? And this is really, this fits perfectly with that one line from the Mea Shiloach and what Reb Tzadok are talking about, right? Let's go back to the Mea Shiloach. He says, Ki kol inyanei ha'olam hazeh heim kechalom hatzarich pitaron ukemo sheyiftor lo adam kein yakum. Right? So your life is like a dream that you need to interpret. Now, interpretation of dreams is not something scientific. It's more of an art than a science, right? And as you interpret it, that's how it is. He's saying basically we need to interpret ourselves. That's really becoming a poet of your life. And that's where the power exists. Okay. Now let me give two examples of this, okay, two applications of this, both from the son of the Mea Shiloach, Rav Yaakov Leiner of Radzin, okay? The first is from Chet Adam HaRishon, from the sin of Adam HaRishon in Gan Eden. And he has a very novel interpretation of the sin. It says, Mikol Eitz Hagan, the source on the left. Mikol Eitz Hagan, Achol Tochel. Ume'etz hadat tov hara, lo tochal mimen. Okay, that's just a quote of the pasuk, right? From all the trees, from among all the trees you may eat, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you should not eat from it. Okay? Bi'er bazeh, he's quoting his father, right? Shela'atid keshitukan hachet me'adam harishon, az yet tzeruf hapsukim mikol eitz hagan achol tochel, ume'etz hadat tov. I'm going to explain this in a second. V'achar ze yeh katuv v'ra lo tochal. Listen to this. You have to have your seatbelts on, even though you're at home. He says, in the future, right, la'atid lavo, right, there'll be a different interpretation of this pasuk. Like right now, what does the pasuk say? That Adam HaRishon can't eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov Hara. Okay? He says in the future, we will punctuate the passage differently, and it will mean something else. He says as follows, I'm going to read it again. Shila'atid, the third line from the top that's still underlined. Shila'atid keshitukan hachet me'adam harishon. In the future time, when the sin of Adam will be rectified, as yetziruf ha-psukim, then the punctuation of the psukim will be different. It will read as follows, quote, Mikol eitz hagan achol tochal, you shall eat from all the trees of the garden, ume'etz hadat tov, including from the tree of knowledge of good. And there'll be a comma. V'achar zeh yeh hakatuv, and after that it will say, v'ra lo tochal, and from the evil part you will not eat. In other words, it will become clear that Adam HaRishon only ate from the Eitz Hadat Tov, and he never ate from the Eitz Hadat Ra. Now, there's empirical data here. He ate this fruit from some tree, but what is the nature of the fruit that he ate? That is open to interpretation. That depends on how you punctuate the pasuk, right? Here, I'm going to continue reading it. Ki Hashem yitbarach yivarer, because God will clarify, shelo achal rak hatov, that he only ate. God will clarify at the end, we will understand that Adam HaRishon only ate from the Eitz Hadat Tov, and not from the Eitz Hadat Ra. Okay? Ki haseder shel divrei Torah. Okay, because it depends upon how you interpret. Now let me just go down here a little bit. Here where it says, like 1 second, 8 lines from the bottom. Yeah, where it says v'chein kan yachol. Everybody with me? The last word on the line is yachol. Yeah, v'chein kan yachol litbarer hatseruf ye'im shelefanav, because here we can combine the pasuk in a different way. Ki Hashem yitbarach, listen very carefully here. Ki Hashem yitbarach natan umasar hadavar levurei ha'adam. God gave over the interpretation of what happened into the hands of human beings. Human beings will clarify and interpret the empirical events of the Chet of Adam HaRishon. Right? I'm going to read that again. Ki Hashem yitbarach natan umasar hadavar leveirurei ha'adam shehu ba'atzmo yivarer zot, that Adam, the humanity, and Adam HaRishon, they themselves will clarify for us what happened. Now listen to this. This is really good in terms of Pshat. This may seem very far away from Pshat because you're looking at the story that we all learned in Kita Aleph many years ago, right? And now he's saying, wait a second. You might say, like, is there a way of interpreting the story that Adam HaRishon wasn't Chote? No, of course not. This is the only way to understand it. God told him not to eat from the tree, and he ate from the tree. But he's saying, no, we can look at it differently. Because he noticed that in Pshat, uve'emet ra'inu, because in truth we see, shelo hichlit HaKadosh Baruch Hu she'Adam HaRishon achal ma shenitztava shelo yochal. We never see that God determines that Adam HaRishon transgressed his command. God never did. This might be surprising, but he's looking at the psukim very carefully. He says we never see that God determined that Adam HaRishon ate from what he was forbidden to eat. How do we see that? Ki amar lo rak derech she'elah. He didn't come to him. God did not come to Adam HaRishon and say, "You ate from the tree that I told you not to eat from." He only asked him, "She'amar lo rak derech she'elah." Hamin ha'etz asher tziviticha leviltiach chol mimenu achalta. He just asked him, did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from? V'lazeh moreh, and this shows, the Rabbi Yaakov Leiner says, lazeh moreh b'feirush ki bei ba'adam kaima milta. the answer to this question depends on man. In other words, Adam HaRishon had the answer in his hand. God said, did you? And whatever will be depends on Adam HaRishon's own interpretation. Bei ba'adam kaima milta. Inside the person does it depend. Lefi sheyitbarer, as it will become clear. V'yuchal liyot shelo achal rak hatov v'lo hara. And it is possible that he ate only from the good and not from the evil. Now, this interpretation is saying that there are different ways of reading the Torah. There are different interpretations, and even interpretations which seem to be chiseled in stone. There's no other way of understanding it. He says, if you look carefully, it's open-ended. Kasher, in a sense, going back to the words of his father, of the Mashilach, Kasher yiftor kein yakum. As you interpret it, so it shall be. Right? And there's even room to interpret the most basic story, the first story of God and humanity in Sefer Bereshit, which we think is cast in stone and is unchangeable because it's history, or it's sacred history, that Adam HaRishon was chote. No, in the end, we're going to find from a different perspective that this was a good thing that happened. That we had to go through all of human history in order to arrive. We don't have this perspective yet, right? But in order to arrive at whatever we're going to arrive at, that this was necessary. The same way that Yosef is trying to instruct his brothers, this is the Beis Yaakov, Yaakov Liner's interpretation of the way Adam HaRishon is supposed to relate to God and how we're supposed to relate to possibilities. And the possibilities are a fruit of the possibility of interpretation. Okay. Now I just want to finish, we have a few more minutes, with the following piece. Okay, one moment, let me just move this here. The following piece from the Beit Yaakov as well, where he spells this out. Here he talks about, this is a different context. He talks about the fact that Yaakov, before he met Esav, right, that he was very fearful, right? So the question, of course, is but he had a promise from God that God would take care of him. So why was he fearful? Why couldn't he just rely on God's guarantee that God will care for him? Right? Vayira Yaakov, I'm reading now. Vayira Yaakov ma'od vayetzer lo. Right? So Yaakov was in great fear and anguish and anxiety. Bamidrash, in the Midrash it says, Mikan she'ein haftacha latzadikim ba'olam hazeh. There's no security. The Midrash says, we see from here, there's no security for tzaddikim in this world. And there's no, even though God promises. Okay? Ha'inyan bazeh. I'm going to what's underlined here. Ha'inyan bazeh. One second. Okay? Ha'inyan bazeh. Who? She'ein b'ma'amarei Hashem yitbarach perush mugbal. There isn't, this goes back again to interpretation. There isn't a limited interpretation to God's words. Sheyomar lecha adam alav re'ei zehu amitat perush hadavar. How often do we hear this? We hear somebody says, this is the correct interpretation. This is the only way to understand it, right? He's saying that's not true, right? There isn't a limited interpretation that someone could say, behold, this is the true interpretation. And it's impossible to interpret it differently. It says there's no such thing as that, right? Mikfi tfisato. And there's no other way of explaining it from his perspective. Person should not think that that's true. Because God's words are living. Because the words of the Torah, the words of God, you ever hear like the term dead letter, right? There are dead words, right? They're dead words, they're like idols. They mean what they mean, and there's nowhere to go with them. right? That's like bad literature. Sometimes you can't even call it literature. It is what it is. There's no way of interpreting it. It's two-dimensional. There's no life to it, okay? But the words of God are living, and the characteristic of life is the ability to change and develop. So those words, how do words change and develop? Through novel interpretation. Ki divrei Hashem yitbarach chayim v'kayamim, ubima'at rega yuchal lishtanot haperush me'otam hadvarim atzmam. Shekodem ze haya nireh la'adam perush hadvarim b'li shum hishtanut rak kamo shelamad behem. Because beforehand, a person looks at something and they say, this is what it means, because it's the way I learned what it means. Like he's really talking to contemporary, he's talking to us. We learn things. You learn things in yeshiva and say, this is how I understood it, and this is what it means. That a person suddenly sees that, no, that way of understanding, it doesn't work anymore. There's no way of understanding it the way that I understood it. There has to be a new way of understanding it. Now, here he takes a jump. Until now, you could say, if you want to talk about this in the context of Nietzsche, right? He's talking about interpretation of literature, right? It's divine literature, but for our purposes, it doesn't matter. He's saying that the divine literature is always open to interpretation. According to the way we interpret it, that's the way it is, okay? Now he makes the same jump that Nietzsche makes. He makes the jump from literature, for an interpretation of text, to interpretation of life. I'm continuing here. Ulezehu shoresh ha'emunah. And this is the source of faith. Shelo yomar ha'adam shedavar zeh efshar lihiyot. A person should never say, and now he's not talking about interpretation of texts anymore. He's talking about life. You should never say, this is impossible, right? Why? Because nothing is impossible for God. And he's not only talking about nothing is impossible in interpretation of text, nothing is impossible in life, because God is also not only the author of the text, he's also the author of life. Okay? And to say that something is impossible is, in a sense, kfira, right? Because you're basically saying that God can't make it so. It's Hashem yitbarach lo shayach lomar kein. Etzlo yitbarach hakol yachol liyot. Because with God, anything can be. V'lo yipameli min davar. Right? And now let's give an example. Okay, I'm skipping a little bit just to give an example. Okay? Ukimo, this is the part which is underlined. Ukimo ba'akedat Yitzchak. Okay, so we're gonna read in the Torah Akedat Yitzchak on Rosh Hashanah. So think about this. Ukimo ba'akedat Yitzchak. Sha'amar Hashem Yitbarach. Here's his reading of the Akedah. Sha'amar Hashem Yitbarach la'Avraham Avinu shi'alehu le'olah. This is a medrash, right? That what does God say to Avram in the command of the Akedah? Offer him up as an offering. Ha'alehu le'olah. And how does Avram Avinu interpret that? He understands that he has to shecht his son, right? Because what do you do with an olah? An olah is a pure burnt offering, right? So that's how he interprets it, yeah? Hashem, it's Amar Hashem Yitbarach l'Avram Avinu she'alehu le'olah.
You have to call.
Tfisat. Can people mute themselves? I need you to mute yourself.
Great.
Okay?
Oh, wait a second.
Ukefi tfisat seichel ha'adam, right? According to the perspective of human understanding, hu ha'perush she'alehu la'olah kalil Hashem kedin olah. So Avram Avinu understood it within the limits of his human understanding. What that means is that he has to bring his son Yitzchak as a korban, literally. Okay? V'achar zeh, but after that, Her'ah Hashem Yitbarach, v'he'ir b'tfisato sheperush hadvarim hu rak laha'aleyu. right? Remember, this is a midrash. God says, when I said ha'aleu la'olah, I didn't say shechtim, I just said bring him up. And since you already put him on the mizbeach, you can now take him off the mizbeach. You put him up on the mizbeach, now you can take him off. In other words, the revelation to Avram is really interesting how he's reading. When the malach says, al tishlach yadcha lanar, which is an exterior way of telling the story, what really happened is Avram Avinu had a new way of being mefaresh God's words. That's how he's reading it, right? Based on the midrash, right? But emphasizing this. In other words, it might have seemed to be cast in stone that God commanded Avram to kill Yitzchak. But lo and behold, there's another way of interpreting it. And that's the revelation at the end of the Akedah, right? So ha'aleyu, but not shachteyu. And why is that? He emphasizes this again. V'chol zehu mipnei shedivrei Hashem yitbarach chayim v'nov'im tamid mimekor chayim. K'mo she'adam chai yishtanu machshivotav kol rega v'rega. This is possible because the words of God are drawn from the source of life. And just as human beings are alive, and that means their thoughts are constantly changing, God's words are constantly open to new interpretation. Okay? Now, this is very interesting. This is a double-edged sword. V'lezeh, what are the conclusions of this reality? That reality bears, you can say, infinite interpretations because that's an expression of the infinite power of God. Okay? That's a double-edged sword. And he's going back to Yaakov. And that's what it means when we say tzaddikim cannot have security in this world. You can't say God said to me this and it means it'll be okay. You don't know that because maybe there'll be a different way of interpreting it. And this lesson in humility is very important today, especially for Dati Lumi people who are right-wing, okay? Without criticizing whether you want to be right-wing or not, but humility is always good all around, right? Because it's impossible to know how the interpretation may change. And what is the ramification of that? And that's why Yaakov Avinu, even though he had a promise from God that God will protect him, he was still fearful of Esav and he still needed to turn to God and pray. Because you never know what the haftacha, how God will interpret what he said back then. Okay? Now, the reason I say this is a double-edged sword, one side of this way of looking at things, namely that there's always ways to interpret which are unexpected. One way is that generates, how does that affect us? That generates humility and yira and the need to tread very carefully and to know that we don't know because life is complicated the way a text is complicated. And life is alive and the text is alive. So there's always new ways of interpreting, okay? So that generates yira, fear, because you never know. So you have to tread carefully, okay? On the other hand, the other side of this goes back to that Gemara from the beginning, that's donot nasot schuyot. It's very empowering because my interpretation, this is what Nietzsche would say, and it's also what the Mashloch would say. Kasher yiftoroto ken yakum etzlo. On the one hand, you're powerless because the book is written, but on the other hand, the interpretation is in your hands. So you may be powerless to change the empirical facts, but the meaning of those facts, the perspective of those facts, and how you interpret those facts imprint on who you are and how you move forward. And that is in our hands. So there's a double-edged sword here in terms of the openness of interpretation. On the one hand, the humility that it must induce from us is that we're not in control and it's living and it's changing. On the other hand, we, through our interpretation, fashion ourselves in the world. And that's something that we are in control of, right? So I think that's the meaning of that Gemara of Zdonot. They could become shkagot. They could be redefined by us, but they'll still, they may still weigh upon us, but only less so if they're now shkagot where there was donot. But there is also a possibility through tshuva, through gathering up all our mental, psychological, and spiritual energy to reinterpret what has happened in a different context, and that can make the zdonot into zchuyot. So in that sense, through the power that we have to interpret, we can actually change the past. Which I think that's what the Gemara is saying, through the help of these Hasidic masters and through the help of Nietzsche. Okay, so I would like to wish everyone Ktiva v'chatima tova, really the best, and we should be able to marshal our strength to be able to interpret ourselves in a way which puts us in the world in a way which is loving and positive, and that should imprint itself upon ourselves, our families, our neighbors, Klal Yisrael, and the world.
Amen.
Shana tova to everyone. It was great to see you all.